Hi everyone and welcome back to Story of the World Highlights. Today we're going to be discussing Chapter 40. Chapter 40 talks about Chernobyl and the end or beginning of the end of the Cold War. So let's get started. To begin, Chernobyl. For those of you who may not know, Chernobyl was a nuclear power plant in Russia. Specifically, it was 80 miles north of Kiev. Now, this event happened on April 25th, 1986 at 1:30 in the morning. Now, what happened was the power plant exploded in its fourth reactor where it was splitting atoms. Because for those of you who may not know, nuclear power comes from the splitting of atoms. You may remember that from when we learned about atomic power before. Now, when you split atoms, if it goes wrong, big explosions can happen. And that's what happened here. It is the worst nuclear power plant event to ever happen in world history, actually. And it killed initially 30 people in just the explosion, but over 400,000 people had long-term health consequences due to this and the radioactivity that came from it. Now, a little background on nuclear power or atomic fusion. So in 1951, it was discovered that nuclear power could be used to create energy and power things. And in 1953, we started to see people get nervous about this radioactivity and nuclear power because you see, radioactivity is the exposure to different radio waves and things that are bad for your body to be exposed to. They come from this type of power. Now, people were nervous about the safety of all of this and being near nuclear power plants in places where they were producing nuclear energy. So we saw President Eisenhower of America give a speech to the UN called The Atoms of Peace, where he talked about the fact that there is radioactivity risks, but we can try and minimize these risks and ultimately use this clean source of power to help fuel things instead of using things like oil, which is limited in supply. Now, in 1954, we saw the first commercial use of a power plant. The first commercial use, meaning that they sold it and it was owned by a company. In 1955, we saw the first city in the world be powered completely by nuclear energy, and this was in Idaho. Now, in 1979, we had our first major incident where a nuclear power plant caused problems. And this was known as the 3 Mile Island incident. 3 Mile Island was a place in America where there was a nuclear power plant on a small island that was 3 miles long. And in this island, we saw the leakage of some of this energy, and it led to 1 millirem, which is the measurement of radioactivity. It led to 1 millirem of radioactivity exposure to people in the surrounding area. Now, this is about as much as you would get exposed to in an X-ray machine. That's why X-ray machines have usually really heavy lead vests that you wear inside to protect you. So overall, there wasn't significant damage done to people or the area, but it was the first incident to happen and the biggest one in America. Now, going back to Chernobyl, Chernobyl's event that happened led to over 600,000 people being exposed to radioactivity. And this even caused animals to become mutated and have different features and different problems that they wouldn't normally have had. And it impacted places as far away as Sweden. So again, radioactivity, this exposure affects your cells in your body and can affect different parts of you for sure. Now, the land that in this area will remain radioactive for over 1,000 years. So even today, the land in Chernobyl is not safe to be growing things on and not really safe for people to live there. Now, these days, despite these nuclear incidences that have happened, over a fifth of the world's energy is powered by nuclear power. So that's a little bit about the first part of our chapter. The second part of our chapter talks about the melting of the Cold War. So finally, in the 1980s, the thawing of the Cold War began. We say thawing because if you think of a Cold War, when cold is becoming warm, it melts or thaws. You see this little ice cube melting. And the two big players in this event was President Reagan of the United States and the head of the Communist Party in the USSR, Gorbachev. Now, the things that led to this melting were three things. First, perestroika, or the economic melting that happened in Russia. This was when Gorbachev decided to allow people to start owning their own businesses instead of having the government own all business. So people were able to start making money individually. The second thing that happened was something known as glasnost, or openness. This meant that people in Russia were allowed to start having freedom of speech and being able to say what they wanted in newspapers and publications, which, if you remember before, they would have been sent to the Gulag for. The last thing that helped sort of lead to the end of the Cold War was the Intermediate Range Nuclear Forces Treaty, or the INF Treaty. Now, what this treaty meant was that nuclear weapons or short-range missiles would have to be limited or taken away from major countries. Now, the reason they decided to do this was because the two countries, the US and the USSR, were really scared of weapons and of one country attacking the other. So if they ran out of weapons, the other country might attack them. Or if they took away their weapons, they might be weak and at risk of being attacked. So removing weapons would be the thing that would help lessen the tension between these two countries. So they decided to have no more short-range missiles. You may be asking, why short-range missiles specifically? Well, that was because the U.S. did not want to get rid of its long-range missiles because it wanted to do something called peace through strength, which meant that if it still had ways to make people fearful, then they wouldn't be able to be victim of being attacked. People would still be too scared to attack them. So still having long-range missiles meant that they would be protected, but reducing short-range missiles would mean less tension from both sides. So this is the end of chapter 40, and I will see you next time for Story of the World Highlights. Bye-bye.